So, very important section, guys. This is the tube paint mixing. So we're now going to add a colorant to our pouring medium. Now, whether your colorant is paint or pigments, we do mix them quite differently. So I'm going to start with the tube paint mixing. Now, this is a difficult thing to explain because tube paints or little bottled paints like these ones come in all different viscosities. So starting off with the thinnest paint that I would choose to use for this technique would be a high flow paint. So this is Golden High Flow. It's a step up from ink. Ink is very watery. High flow paint is a little bit thicker than ink, although it does kind of act a little bit like ink. It is a little bit thicker. So we can definitely get away with that, but we need to make sure that our pouring medium is thick enough to handle a high flow colorant. Second, we'll move on to fluid paint. Now, fluid paint is a step up in thickness or in viscosity to a high flow. Fluid paint is a really good all-rounder for the bloom technique. The reason being is it's a medium to light viscosity paint, and it's quite easy to adjust either way with your untinted paint base or Josonja Gloss Varnish, or a mix of Josonja Gloss Varnish and water, which I'll go through in detail with you later on in the course, but I may be using it in this section, so don't worry if you don't know how to mix it, that is coming up. When you see me add the Josonja water mix, which we call JOWA for short, don't forget that you can always refer to the segment in the course that is for mixing your Josonja and water mix for thinning. So there'll be a section in the course later on for thickening up your mix or thinning out your mix. So don't worry if you don't get that right now, you'll know how to mix it later. Okay, so a step up from the fluid paint would be a medium viscosity paint. Generally they come in a tube, not a bottle. Some do come in bottles, but most do come in tubes. So the Holcroft Professional Artist Acrylic is a medium viscosity paint. It's also a nice one to work with. It's a little bit thick, thicker than the fluid, but we can always thin that out with a little bit of water or Josonja or a blend of both. The last one we're going to address is a heavy body paint. So I'm going to use the Golden Heavy Body in the tube. I've got a dark blue here, anthraquinone blue, and I'm going to show you how, even though this is quite thick, we can definitely get it working by adjusting our mix once we put it into the pouring medium. Okay, so I have my pre-mixed pouring medium that we did in the pouring medium section. It's still looking a little bit like condensed milk or warm honey. It's drizzling off the stick. Now, this isn't going to be perfect for all of these paints, but what I'm going to do is fill up 1/3 of a cup into each of these containers. I'm going to then add my colorant, which will be either my high flow, fluid, medium, or heavy body. And I'm going to show you how to adjust these so that they're perfect before you start pouring. Now look, we're going to adjust these now so that they look perfect to us now, but what's going to happen is some of them will settle in the cup over time. Some of them only take a couple of minutes to thicken up or thin out if that's what they're going to do. Others might do it overnight, so tomorrow you might find that some of your mixes are a little bit off and we need to adjust them. So we're going to cover all of that in this section. Okay, so basically I'm just going to pour about 1/3 to 1/2 a cup. Baby cup, I mean, not an actual cup. So we're looking at about 20 to 30 mils of our pre-mixed pouring medium into these cups. Okay, so we don't want to adjust our cup of pouring medium because when we add our high flow paint, this needs to be thick enough to carry the high flow paint. Okay, so we're going to start off with our medium viscosity pouring medium and work out how to thicken that up or thin it out depending on what you are using as your colorant. Okay, so we'll start with the thinnest. Now the golden high flow, there's a little ball inside. If you're using this particular brand, you want to make sure you give it a bit of a shake up. Get that ball rolling inside the bottle to make sure there's none of your goodness sitting down here on the bottom that hasn't been mixed in properly. So make sure that's nice and mixed in. Okay, so we're definitely not going to measure for this section of the course. We need to be able to eyeball this, and we need to be able to adjust it to what we know we're looking for. So starting off with the theory that less is more, we're just going to add a little squirt of that. I'm going to use the skinny end of my stick to mix it through. And as you can see, because our paint base is not white, it's clear, it's allowing that colour to come through quite nicely. Okay, so we don't quite have that depth of colour that we're looking for, that we want this permanent violet dark to look like. So we'll put a little bit more in. Going to mix it really well while we're scraping down the sides. Make sure none of that intense colour is getting stuck on the edge or at the bottom. Then we're just going to pick it up and drizzle it off the end of the stick like this. Now what we're looking for is not something that's watery, that's going to flow straight back into the mix without leaving a small trace on the top there. Okay, so that to me looks quite like the perfect consistency. What that's also telling me is when we move on to our fluid, medium body and heavy body, is that we're going to need to thin it out. So with the high flow, we probably don't need to do too much with this mix right now. We're just going to let that sit. And we're going to check it again before we try to execute a bloom with that particular colour. We're always going to check our paints to make sure that they're ready to go before we actually start pouring. That way, if any adjustments need to be made, we can do it before we start. Have them all mixed up and ready so that we don't pop on 2 colours onto our bloom and then we have to go and adjust our 3rd colour. We want to adjust them immediately before we start to execute our pour. Okay, so we'll pop that one aside. That's the high flow. Next is the fluid. Golden also do a fluid. Let me show you what they look like. Okay, so golden fluid acrylics. We can't get these in Australia, but quite accessible around the rest of the world. So if you choose to use the golden brand instead of the Matisse, go for it. Put that one over there. Okay, so let's remove the little safety piece of foil inside. These Matisse mini fluid tubes, they also have a ball inside to make sure that all that colour is being mixed thoroughly. Okay, so same as before, we're just going to put a little squirt in. Less is more, so start with a little bit less. You'll know if you haven't put enough in because it's really not going to reach that beautiful depth of colour that you see the paint is meant to be on the bottle. If it's a little bit pale, we're going to use some more. Okay, so that seemed to be the perfect little squirt amount there. Okay, so this one's also looking good, but what can happen with these Matisse fluids is they can thicken over time. This particular brand seems to be really well known for thickening upon standing, which means once I leave that for a couple of hours and come back, it's probably going to be quite a lot thicker than that. I'm not sure if it's to do with evaporation or just the particular paint, the polymer, all that technical stuff that can change the way a paint behaves and after it's been sitting for a little while. So that looks pretty good to me as well. I don't think at this stage I have to thin that out, but we may possibly have to do that when I check them after I finish mixing. Okay, next let's go for the medium viscosity, which is the Holcroft. Today I'm going to use the Phthalo Blue as an example. It's a beautiful paint here in Australia. You can get it from the Riot Art Store. So don't forget to check at the end of the course for where you can buy all the products that I'm using today in the course. Online only, but very affordable. Definitely worth looking into where to get this one. Okay, so I'm just going to put a little sort of couple of splodges in there. Start to mix it up. It's really highly pigmented, this paint, so you really don't need a lot to get that true color. I can already tell that that is a little bit thick, but as we've been doing with our high flow and our fluid, we're just going to let it sit there so we can assess it at the end of our mixing session and see what we need to do. Always closing the lids too, because we don't want air getting on top of that and creating a film on top, or thickening it up because of the air that's in that container. Okay, lastly is the heavy body. Now it's quite difficult for me to use heavy body paint using the Taubman's Neutral, which is our untinted paint base, because it's quite thick here in Australia. Trying to get away with using a really heavy body paint it's probably not the best option for us Aussies here. We'll definitely go for something a little more fluid or medium body, but we can still make it work. And if you're overseas and your paint base is quite thin, these might be the perfect choice for you, because they might allow you to thicken up your pouring medium without having to try to add too much of the paint base, which, if you do have a thin paint base, then obviously you can't rely on that too much to thicken up your mix like we can here in Australia. But yeah, using a heavy body paint is probably the perfect solution for that. If you do have a thin paint base, we definitely want you using a thicker body or a thicker viscosity paint. That'll be the answer to all your problems. So I need to be really careful not to add too much of this. Now, luckily, because I'm using golden, they are very heavily pigmented. So you really don't need to use that much. So I've just put a little bit on my spoon there. I've got my 1/3 of a cup to 1/2 a cup, 20 to 30 ml pouring medium in here. And I'm just going to mix that in. Knowing too well, for me here in Australia with my paint base, my untinted paint base, my Taubman's, it's definitely going to be too thick, but I'm going to show you how I can get this working for me. See how it's not really running off the stick in a stream like that. It's quite globby, and it really is dropping in chunky bits of runny paint. So we know straight away looking at that is way too thick. Okay, so we're going to get back to that one in a minute, and I'm going to show you how to thin that out. Okay, let's revisit our first mix, which is the Golden High Flow. Let's have a look if anything has happened to that while it's been sitting there. Now, what you might not be able to see on the screen there, but I can definitely notice, is that there's some bubbles. They're coming up to the top. Now, when you're mixing paint into pouring medium, you are going to create air bubbles. So this is why it's a really good idea to pre-mix your paints the night before you're going to have a blooming session or a painting session. The reason for that is your paint can become quite silky overnight once all the air bubbles rise to the surface over the 24-hour period, or even maybe 12 hours. You'll notice that all the bubbles come to the top. So you don't really need to worry about removing those bubbles. All you need to do is just gently mix them back in. Let's just pretend I made these last night and I'm talking to you today. The bubbles seem to dissipate inside the mixing there, and you're left with a silky smooth mix there, ready to bloom with. Okay, so that has thickened up a little bit. Now the reason I didn't adjust my pre-mixed pouring medium I probably could have put a little bit more Josonja in there, or maybe a little bit of water to thin that out, but I'm not going to, because I'm going to show you how to do it now in the cup. So don't forget, if you see me using this, this is what I like to call Josonja water. We call it Jo-Wa for short. If you find that a little bit hard to understand, the easier version is, it's basically just Josonja Gloss Varnish mixed with water. So it's just like a really, really, really thin version of the Josonja Gloss Varnish. But yeah, we'll cover that more in the in a section closer to the end of the course for thickening and thinning out your mixes. So because this isn't overly too thick, I am going to go ahead and use my straight Josonja from the bottle. I'm just going to add a little splash like that. Continue mixing. Don't put too much in, because you'll be very surprised what effect that can have on the paint mix. Just a little splash, a little few drops of the Josonja, and that's back to perfection. So I'm really happy with that mix now. Drizzling off the bottom of the spoon in a nice thin stream. It's not starting to break up until the very end, when there's not much paint left on the stick. It starts to drip. But right up until that point, it is quite a uniform stream of paint coming off the bottom of that stick. Okay, so that one there is ready to go. Okay, moving on to the Matisse Dioxazine Purple Fluid. So we're working with a paint now that's a little bit thicker than the High Flow. So let's have a look what has happened to this while it's been sitting there. Okay, it's looking fairly good as far as drizzling off the stick goes. I'm really liking that. So I'm not going to go for my Josonja plus my water mix, which is a really thin version of the varnish there. Just going to go straight back for my Josonja Gloss Varnish again, because I think a little drizzle of that will make this Dioxazine Purple nice and silky and bring it back there to the perfect consistency. So you can see now that stream is just running a little bit more uniform. It's not dropping off in clumps. It's holding its stream when we drizzle it back into the cup. Okay, so happy with that one. Now, moving on to our medium viscosity paint, the Holcroft Phthalo Blue. We're probably going to find that we don't want to add too much varnish to these mixes. What can happen if you add too much varnish is you might have a problem with your painting drying. Varnish tends to crack, so we need to be careful not to add too much. So this is where our little mix is going to come in, where we've mixed some Josonja Gloss Varnish with some water. So it's basically still like using a water-based polyurethane varnish, but as you can see, it's much, much, much thinner because we've mixed it with water. Okay, so it's very drippy. It's not drizzling. It's not running off the spoon like warm honey, like the Josonja Gloss Varnish tends to have quite a nice stream running off the stick when it's just straight varnish. This one's very watery, very drippy. And the reason we did that was we want to add a little bit of water to this, and we want to add a little bit of varnish. But the problem with adding water is if you make a cup of water like this and you go to add a little bit, it's very, very easy to add too much. Even a couple of drops too much when it's just water can be devastating to the mix, and you'll be left with something that is so thin and runny that you just can't fix it. So what it does, adding the Josonja and the water together, is it controls how much water you're putting into it by making sure there is a bit of varnish in there as well. So we're just going to add a little bit at a time. It's definitely better to add less rather than more in this situation, because we definitely don't want to take it too far and make it too thin. Okay, so that looks pretty good to me. Might just add a tiny little more drizzle. And now it's looking very much like the other two, the first two that we've mixed. It's drizzling nicely off the stick. And so I think that one's pretty much ready to go. Okay, last but not least, let's adjust our heavy body. We've got our golden anthracnone blue, gorgeous golden color there. So as we saw when we put that in, the heavy body paint is very, very thick. We were never going to get away with using my pre-mixed pouring medium for this particular viscosity of tube paint, let me tell you. It's going to be quite sludgy, very thick, and we're definitely going to be relying on not simply the Josonja Gloss Varnish, but the Josonja mixed with water. So the very thinned out version of the polyurethane water-based varnish. So I'll just show you what that looks like dripping off the stick so you know what's definitely too thick. See how it's not running at all? It's really, really quite sludgy and globby, and it's really coming off in chunks there. So we want to get that drizzling. So let's not be careful to add too much. Even just using a little spoon like this can put enough in. Rather than tipping it, it's really easy to put too much in when you tip it from the container. Until you get a little bit more experience and you know exactly how much you want to come out of that container, it's definitely better to use your little stick. Okay, so we're getting a little bit better, but we're still coming off that stick in kind of blobs, and we don't want that. We're looking for that stream. So let's go for a bit more. Let's put 2 in this time, 2 little scoops. Now you might only have to do this a few times, measuring it with the spoon. Well, not measuring it, but making sure you're holding back from putting too much in by using the spoon. When you start to get really experienced, you can probably just pour straight from the tub. You'll know how much you need and how much you don't need, but it really is a matter of practice makes perfect with this adjusting. All right, let's have a look at that. Okay, it's getting a little bit better, but I don't think it's quite there yet. It's leaving a little bit too much of a trace on top of itself there when I pop it back into the container. I could pretty much write my name Shelley in there, and when I get to the end of my name, I'm still going to be able to see it. So we don't want that. We want it to be a little bit thinner again. So as you can see, we've added the most of our Josonja and water mix to this heavy body, and that's because it's been our thickest paint. And the problem with using the heavy body is, you know, to get the intensity of the color, you might need to add quite a lot of the paint, but we don't really want to do that because it's full of fillers and it's very, very thick. So in the section where we talk about thickening up your mix or thinning out your mix, we'll also talk about adding ink to these thicker heavy body paints, as well as some of the Josonja Gloss Varnish and water mix, or even just the Josonja on its own. But ink can play a really big part in thinning out your mix, especially if you're looking for extra vibrancy. But we're going to cover that in the section later in the course where we thin out and thicken our paints. So I'm really looking forward to showing you how that works. Okay, so that's looking pretty good there. I know it's going to probably settle and get a little bit thicker, so we're just going to add a little bit more of that in. Make sure we're definitely getting that drizzle off the stick in a nice steady stream. before we let that sit and we let the air bubbles settle so that's ready to use. Okay, so there you go. We've gone through high flow right through to heavy body. I hope that helps you guys mixing your tube paint into your pouring medium. And might put those guys aside, let them settle, and see if we can use them for a demonstration later on in the course.